I'm Margot Cunniff, Research Program Manager at the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics at George Washington University. Thank you for joining us for our Research Spotlight series. I'm very happy to introduce our next speaker, Madeline Jalbert, who is a postdoctoral scholar at the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public. She holds a PhD in social psychology from the University of Southern California. Excuse me. Her research investigates how people make judgments of truth and risk in naturalistic contexts. This work focuses on the role of context and subjective experiences in guiding belief over time, with the goal of preventing and correcting the spread of misinformation. So naturally, that leads into the topic of today's presentation. She is joined today by her colleague and collaborator, Morgan Wack, who is a PhD candidate in political science and a research associate at the University of Washington's Center for an Informed Public. His research explores the impact of social media and internet access on electoral processes in the global South. His work at CIP aims to improve, excuse me, our collective understanding of the impact of misinformation on political outcomes. And prior to his PhD studies, Morgan conducted work for the Clinton Health Access Initiative as an advisor to the South African National Department of Health, focused on minimizing the influence of health-related misinformation. So these are all important topics that everyone here at IDDP is very much interested in and focused on. So we look forward to the presentation, and please take it away, Maddie.
All right, great. I'm gonna go ahead and share slides then. Okay, so Morgan and I are very excited to be here today and share some initial results of this project that we've been working on through funding at IDDP. And so we're calling, the title of this talk is Misinformation in a Divided Democracy, an analysis of the prevalence and influence of lies, rumors, and unfounded conspiracy in Kenya's 2022 election. And so I am going to turn things over to Morgan to talk about some background to give you context for this work.
Great, thank you, Maddie, and thanks to everybody for being here. I'll try to give you a brief background. I'll try to summarize everything about all of recent Kenyan democratic history and the recent election very briefly, so we are all working from sort of similar foundations here. So essentially, starting from the beginning, as I'm sure everyone here knows, the spread of information and communications technologies over the past decade and a half has seen dramatic political and social changes, particularly in the global South, where information access has become widely available for the first time for many rural populations, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And despite this, a lot of the emphasis on the causes and consequences of information access have focused primarily on the United States and Europe, as you'd expect, as it is with many other research areas. Compounding that is the fact that platforms, social media platforms, encrypted messaging applications have invested very little in trying to understand the consequences of their use in global South contexts, as well as the spread of unfounded, non-factual information in these contexts and how it overlaps with consequences on things like elections, but also things related to violence, ethnic conflict, those sorts of problems. This is compounded by additional issues related to expansion of language barriers and other sorts of social contexts that aren't necessarily taken into account when social media expands beyond these areas. So looking specifically at Kenya, which is a recent democracy, a nascent democracy, but a highly lively one, lots of participation, high engagement with political institutions and investment in elections, not just of parties, but for civil societies as well. The judiciary is also heavily involved in the last few elections. The 2017 election, which was the election most recent prior to the 2022 election, was actually annulled. It was one of the first elections annulled on the continent and in the region. It was reheld because of discrepancies in the vote count and problems with the election, electronic vote counting issues. And so there have been many recent problems. However, most relevant to the talk today was the 2007 election, which saw between 800 and 1,500 people killed and between 180,000 and 600,000 people displaced. So a highly contentious election that saw lots of conflict in its aftermath and has sort of hung over every Kenyan election since then. The fear of violence, the fear that disinformation will spread to the the public and will have an influence over post-election foundations. So in this context, people have been very wary of political misinformation, particularly misinformation that stokes fear of violence and stokes fear of fraudulent claims about the election. So you can go to the next slide, Maddie. So looking specifically at the 2022 election, it was contested between two presidential candidates you can see in the top right. These were William Ruto, who was representing the Kenya Kwanza Political Alliance, and Raila Odinga, who's representing the Amizo la Umoja, or the One Kenya Coalition Party. There were a number of things in the build-up to the election that made it seem like this might not be as contentious as some of the last few elections. Particularly, Raila Odinga was shown to be ahead in almost all of the major election polls in the build-up to the election. He was sort of the kind of foundation favorite, and even though he was in opposition to the prior president, Uhuru Kenyatta, he was seen as representing sort of the elites, whereas William Ruto, who eventually ended up winning the election in the first round, was seen, it pitched himself as an outsider despite being the former vice president. And so the other major factor that made it seem like it might not be as contentious was the fact that for the first time since becoming a democracy, the ethnic lines were not necessarily split between the two groups. Both parties had vice presidential candidates from the Kikuyu party, from the largest ethnic group in the area, and so there weren't necessarily the same ethnic underpinnings as prior elections. However, despite these reasons to be optimistic, Ruto's win, which was highly unexpected, not just because he won, but because he was able to get over the 50+1 majority mark in the first round of the election to win, set off appeals from Raila Odinga that went all the way to the Supreme Court, several issues with misinformation, many online rumors about election fraud, spanning from mass conspiracies involving multiple countries and organizations to local rumors about misplaced ballots and fraudulent election materials. Despite this, the IEBC, or the Independent Elections and Border Commission, oversaw the tallying and the presentation of the results to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, although they specifically pointed out that the misinformation that was driving a lot of these issues, they remarked that it had been free and fair and found no evidence of fraud. And in the end, William Ruto was sworn in September. Go to the next slide.
Okay, so that takes us then to the key questions for today's talk. So we did have more questions in our overall project, but in today's talk, we're going to focus on two pieces of them. The first one being, what were individuals' perceptions of election integrity, fraud, and violence over the course of the election process? And then the second question being, how can election observation groups most effectively counter misinformation related to fraud and violence? And so we're going to be showing you measures of those two things. And yeah, so those will be the two things in this talk. And I'm going to then turn it back to Morgan to talk about the methods that we used. And I want to just showcase that the methods here, the way that we were able to recruit participants is for me, as someone that has a lot of experience in running laboratory studies, being able to recruit this number of participants in Kenya, and this was something that Morgan set up, was pretty incredible. And this was a really great opportunity to get data from a large number of people using this funding. And so this was, I think, something that was particularly just the methodology of being able to recruit people as part of this project was very, very interesting and pretty amazing to me coming from my background. Let Morgan talk about this.
So I'll spare you the specific details about how to set up the API, mostly because I probably don't know them off the top of hand anyway, and it took some time to set up. But essentially, we used Facebook recruiting advertisements through a Facebook page that we set up to advertise across Instagram, WhatsApp, and Facebook to recruit participants. And I'll talk about more about that in a second. But using this strategy, we were able to conduct 3 waves of surveys, and it roughly followed this timeline that you see here under the Supreme Court of Kenya. Essentially, we set everything up through May through August, got all the APIs enrolled. We had to enroll with the Kenyan state to ensure that everything was above board and that we were allowed to contact individuals for these purposes and able to use airtime incentives to get them to participate in the survey. And then we held the pre-election survey prior to the election day, so in the beginning of August, before the election on August 9th. And then we followed up with two kind of split surveys in the post-election period, one prior to but following the appeal, and one following the Supreme Court's upholding of the election results. Go to the next slide. So here's a quick overview of the recruitment methods we used. So online advertisements, you can see a couple of those there in the center. These were advertised through our Facebook page, which is shown at the top, which is the CIP social research page, which we created specifically for this project. It allowed us to contact with individual peoples to follow up with them if they had any challenges receiving the incentive that we used to recruit them to the project, to contact them about specific questions they had about the survey itself. It also allowed us to target across various provinces, across age, across gender within Kenya, which allowed us to get a more representative sample of online social media users in the country. On the right, you'll see how we followed up with individual users. So once we have their phone numbers and their keys for the first survey, to contact them again, we used an SMS message to reach out to them to let them know that the second survey was available. They followed up through that, and we were able to contact them multiple times using this method. It also allowed us to contact specific people and to randomize across waves at different time periods to ensure that something wouldn't arise from the Supreme Court decisions, something like that, that we would then could kind of bias our data in one way or the other. Good question. 101 KES is about 80 cents, I believe. It could have changed, but at the time it was about 80 cents. And we also had all the surveys translated into Swahili, which is the lingua franca of most of the country. So you could take it either in English or Swahili.
And I want to draw attention that on the previous slide, it showed that the retention rate from the first wave to the second wave was 77%. The third wave was of the smaller subset of participants, but 77% retention was very high, and that payment for them was a really good payment for that amount of time, which you could see in the demand for people that people were giving to take more of these surveys.
Yeah, I would say that the one downside is that you have to hook up a WhatsApp number to run a lot of these surveys. And so I've had hundreds of messages from Kenyans over the last few months. So this is one downside, certainly, but overall.
Asking for more surveys.
Well. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Always asking for more surveys. And so just to go through the participant demographics, we had an inclusion criteria was essentially successful completion of attention checks. These were simple attention checks, one of which just asked the respondents to select a particular bucket in a particular question, and the other one was a basic math problem. And I think about 98% of people passed the attention check. So there's fairly good engagement with the surveys themselves. The age is about 26, which is higher than the mean age in the country, but expected given that we only interviewed people who are over 18. And then gender skewed male, which is you expect most of these surveys that are online skew male. And I'd say the largest bias in our sample in terms of general population is education. We have a much more highly educated population than the general population. But again, this is to be expected if you're recording individuals or reaching out to individuals who are available online. In terms of the geographic distribution of participants, I was actually fairly pleasantly surprised with the distribution. It was good engagement across all 8 of the provinces. Some variation here and there, but actually quite good representation across the country. And our rural urban splits were about 50-50, which is pretty much exactly what we were hoping for. Yeah, not too much here. This is probably the most promising in terms of demographics. Ethnicity as well, although they're not perfectly layered, we did get a good representation. This makes sense given that they're drawn from across several different provinces, which tend to have higher rates of specific ethnicity support. Nothing here stands out as being largely ungeneralizable. In terms of media use, so this was one of the major focuses in the pre-election period, is where are people actually getting information? What types of social media are people actually using? From data assessed from the 2017 election, you can see that a lot of people were shown to kind of be using Facebook, and some people were pivoting over to WhatsApp. This seems to be the case also in 2022. However, we do see people engaging on Twitter, TikTok as well, which was, as a recent invention, was a big focus of misinformation and disinformation efforts in the pre-election period. There seemed to be a lot of disinformation on TikTok in particular, and some of the things we had to look into about debunking and that we included in some of our misinformation surveys came from TikTok. Otherwise, you see traditional kind of forms of information access, television or radio remain popular amongst the participants. So we have a fairly good range, although most, as you'd expect, have internet access and use it fairly often.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about key survey measures. And so our surveys had a lot of different things. So we kind of focused on some of the main ones are kind of what I'm going to talk about today, or what we're going to be talking about. So we measured voting intent. So prior to the election, do you intend to vote? Who do you intend to vote for? And then afterwards, did you vote? Who did you vote for? We had various measures of perceptions of election integrity, perceptions of fraud, perceptions of violence. And then we also had many measures of trust in different groups, belief and familiarity with common misinformation narratives, both before and after. We had some general knowledge questions. There were some healthcare questions. In the second wave, we did the cognitive reflection task, which is something that psychologists are interested in, that measures tendencies to engage in analytical or intuitive thought. And so we have many different things that we can look at and questions that we have. For this talk, we're going to focus on these top things here, the perceptions of integrity, fraud, and violence, and just some of the measures. But we do have various things that we can also look at, and that we will continue to be looking at. So I'm going to jump right into looking at voting intent and behavior. And so the results you're seeing here are from people that completed both the first and the second wave. There were some people that that completed the first wave and not the second wave, and their results looked similar. But so you can compare before and after. You're just going to be seeing results from people who completed those two waves. So most people said that they were likely or very likely to vote in the upcoming election. Sorry, there's a car. Okay. So people were reporting high likelihood of voting. And then we also looked at who people intended to vote for and then who they reported voting for. And so prior to the election, more people were saying that they were voting for Ruto. And these are people that returned for the second one too. And then people afterwards, more people reported voting for Ruto. But there's fairly consistent in terms of who people intended to vote for and then who later they reported voting for, with some small shifts. We then looked at perceptions of election integrity prior to the election. So we asked people, how free and fair do you expect the upcoming election to be? And this is broken up by people who ultimately voted for Ruto and people who ultimately voted for Odinga. And here, among both Ruto voters and Odinga voters, most people going into the election expected it to be free and fair, those labels are not quite right. The first two should say not at all free and fair, but with major problems. You'll see those correct labels later, but the bottom two are, the bottom one is not at all free and fair, and then free and fair, but with major problems. And so here we found like 90% or more of people were saying that it would be free and fair with minor problems only, or completely free and fair. So that was, we saw this and we were like, oh, this is really good. People are thinking that the election is going to be free and fair. And then we also asked a question pertaining to political violence, asking people how much they personally feared being a victim of political violence. And there is some people saying that they were afraid, and then some people saying not at all. So there was a spread here about fear of political violence. And they were also asked how likely is it that you or someone close to you engages in violence related to the election processes or outcome? And they thought it was generally very unlikely or unlikely that they would engage in violence or someone close to them would engage in violence. Okay, and then we also had a question relating to perceptions of fraud, which was asking people, how accurate do you perceive the following statement to be? That the upcoming election's winner has already been decided behind the scenes by politicians with access to voter information and ballot counts. And most people thought that this was very inaccurate or inaccurate. And so generally it seemed like going into the election, people's perceptions of the likelihood of fraud were relatively low. Okay. And so then what we're going to introduce here is that this was results from the first wave of the survey. And in the second wave of the survey after the election, we decided to do an experimental manipulation. and to test the impact of these election observation statements. And so I'm going to let Morgan then explain these statements.
Great. Yeah. So in addition to the demographics, we have this manipulation that's focused on election observation missions in the country. And so theories of election observation vary, with certain researchers focused on their influence over the conduct of elections themselves, as well as their role in informing international governments, perhaps tied to sometimes election observation missions are tied to specific aid distributions or tied to perceptions of democracy in various countries. However, there's a second arm of research that looks at the effect of election observation missions and their statements on individual perceptions of legitimacy amongst domestic populations themselves. And so this is what we're interested in here, is how can what is the effect of election observation groups on perceptions of integrity of elections and also protections in perceptions of violence. And so we're looking at using kind of based on research from Sarah Bush and Lauren Prather, we decided to focus on one particular election observation group because of typically higher belief in the integrity of domestic election observation groups. And so we looked specifically at the election observation group of Kenya, which is a civil society organization that's known to be nonpartisan and is highly trusted in the country. And from this, we took three real outputs from the election observation group that they put out in the aftermath of the election about their reports, which they used, and they had individuals monitoring over 1,000 polling stations in the country, and they used that information to show that there were no major points of fraud and no major influences of violence. And so those were the full observation statement, a social media statement, a video statement, and then we had a separate group of control that didn't receive any statement prior to filling out the second survey. So for the full statement, this is the most typical output of election observation groups, not just in Kenya, but for international election observation missions and other parts of the world. It is usually a highly dense, kind of complicated document that details very technical issues. And despite this, it's actually the most widely circulated. This is typically what election observation missions focus on and what they distribute most and put the most time into distributing. This version, so for individuals who were treated with this group, they were given the entire election observation statement. So it's 7 pages, which is actually on the short side in terms of election observation statements that typically come out in elections. They had to read, or they didn't actually have to read, but they had to be on the page that showed this statement for at least a minute. They could stay for up to 3 minutes. And so they were given sort of all the information in the most common format of its distribution. The second treatment arm was a video arm. And so this was a 2-minute and 20-second video from the head of the election observation group, who discussed basically a summary of her findings in front of a larger crowd, and kind of gave details about what they found, what they had done for the election. This was circulated on social media in the aftermath, but wasn't invested in as much by the group, nor is it usually a focus of election observation missions. However, we thought that this might be kind of a less technical, easier to disseminate version of these election results in this treatment arm. And finally, we have a social media treatment, which is actually a few social media posts, but this is the first one. It's essentially a summary of the larger statement, but in very straightforward technical means that is meant to be distributed online to a larger population.
Okay. And so in our second survey, participants were randomly assigned to one of these different conditions. And there was also that control condition. And so we were then interested in the impact of these observation statements on these 5 key questions that I'm going to show you. And so at the start of the survey, they saw these statements or they didn't see the statements, and then they got these 5 questions right afterwards. The first one being, based on your beliefs, how free and fair was the recent Kenyan election? Let's see, I'm gonna move my videos here. And then based on your beliefs, how common was election violence? Based on your beliefs, how much of an impact did election violence have on the results of the election? Based on your own beliefs, how common was election fraud during the recent election? And then based on your beliefs, how much of an impact did an election fraud have on the results? We have based on your own beliefs because we didn't want people just reporting what they'd seen in the statements, but going off of their own beliefs. And so I'm going to show you the results of each of these, and they'll be broken down by, we were interested both in did these election observation statements have an impact? And then also, how did the responses from participants differ based on whether they had voted for Ruto or voted for Odinga? Okay, so this is the most complicated graph that you will be seeing today. And so this is also probably our most interesting findings. And so this was the first question people were asked, was based on your own beliefs, how free and fair was the recent Kenyan election? And so if you just focus on the bar of graphs on the top, those are for people who voted for Ruto. The orange bars are on the right are completely free and fair, and the red bars are free and fair, but with minor problems. And then it goes to free and fair, but with major problems, and then not free and fair. So for Ruto voters, each of the 4 graphs corresponds to one of the treatment conditions. For Ruto voters, there wasn't any effect of treatment, but pretty much all Ruto voters were saying that the election was either completely free and fair or free or fair and with minor problems. And so they weren't affected by seeing the treatments from the election observation groups, but they are also saying that the election was free and fair. If you look down then at Odinga voters, now you're seeing that there's a lot more people who are saying that the election was not free or fair, so the blue bar on the left, or free and fair, but with major problems, which is the green bar. And here we did find that the treatments had an impact. And so you can kind of see this if you look, the control is on the right, so that has the highest bar for people saying it wasn't free and fair. If you then look at the treatments, you can see that that bar goes down. And then you can see, if you look at the orange bars, very few people were saying that the election was free and fair in the control, but it is a bit larger in the other conditions. In particular, what we found was that all 3 of these increased people's perceptions of election fairness compared to the control. And here there wasn't a difference among the different treatments, they just all increased perceptions, which is really encouraging, and because these are the people in which you would want these statements to impact. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to our second question, which is about violence. How common was election violence? For this measure and the rest of them, these are two-way ANOVAs. And in terms of how common people thought violence was, we didn't find a significant impact of the statements here of the treatment, but we did find that Odinga voters thought violence was more common than Ruto voters. And so you can see that with more of the purple bars being toward the right and the Ruto bars skewing toward the left. But overall, people were saying that they didn't think that election violence was very common. So most people were low on that scale. So generally, perceptions of how common violence was fairly low. Odinga voters thought that it was a bit more common. And then this in turn is looking at the impact of election violence on the results of the election. And so here we did find a significant effect of the treatment of the statements. And in particular, what we found was that participants who watched the video thought that election violence had less of an impact compared to people who were in the control condition and didn't see anything, and also compared to people who got the full statement. And so here we found some evidence that it seems like the video seems to be perhaps working better than the full statement and working better perhaps than the social media as well, since it was the one that was significantly less than seeing no statement. As you also probably can see from this graph, Ruto voters thought that violence had less of an impact than Odinga voters. And I have a graph of that here, broken down by individual responses. And so the Ruto voters tend to think that election violence had less of an impact than Odinga voters. And generally, they're both fairly low as well. So perceptions of the impact of violence here on results was relatively low. And then turning to perceptions of fraud, this was the question, how common was election fraud? For this question, we didn't find a significant impact of the treatment. You can see very clearly here that Ruto voters thought fraud was not common. So the red bars are almost all the people are not at all common or slightly common. And then the Odinga voters are on the other end with thinking that fraud was very common or extremely common. So whereas before perceptions of fairness were fairly similar among Odinga and Ruto voters, afterwards, there is this very clear split in terms of fraud, which is what you would expect, but it's nice to see that reflected here in the data. We then looked at people's reports of the impact of election fraud. And here there was a marginally significant effective treatment, where it seems like the social media and video conditions were leading people to say that there was less election fraud than the control condition. So both the statement and the video tending to make people think that election fraud had less of an impact, but it didn't quite reach levels of statistical significance. And then we again found that same split where Ruto voters thought election fraud had no impact or maybe a slight impact, whereas Odinga voters thought that election fraud had an extremely large impact on the election results. So there's this very clear split here. I think, okay. And so those are some of the initial takeaways. We still have a lot of data to go through because we have people's ratings of their belief and familiarity with specific misinformation narratives, both those that are aligned with Ruto and those that are aligned with Odinga. We have where people were saying that they were seeing these misinformation narratives. And so kind of some of our next steps will be looking at how those measures correspond to these other judgments that you just saw, and also how do people's general media use correspond to these different things. And we have a number of measures of trust in specific sources. And so there are more pieces there to look at, but just kind of from some of this initial work, some of our takeaways I have here, which were that prior to the election, perceptions of election integrity were generally high for all voters, and concerns for violence were generally low, although there were some voters that were concerned about violence. Post-election, perceptions of election integrity fell for Odinga voters and remained high for Ruto voters. And then perceptions of violence, impact, and prevalence were generally low for both. And then we also found some evidence for the effectiveness of election observation statements. And this was particularly for perceptions of election integrity and for the impact of violence. And it seemed to be that the video statements were working the best out of any of them, followed by the social media statements, but they all seem to be working for that general perceptions of election integrity. But if you had to give people one, that kind of 7-page long document versus this 2-minute video versus the social media statements, it seems like maybe going with the video or the social media statements would be a good method rather than pushing kind of that long document, which is what's often done. So I'm now going to turn things over to Morgan to talk about next steps, because we have a lot of next steps. We also have a lot of other data collected surrounding this, and we've been doing also some kind of additional experimental testing around reducing misinformation impact. So I'll let Morgan talk about a couple of these pieces.
Thanks, Maddie. Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention really quickly just off the back of that was that we had consulted with a few election observers themselves and election observer groups about sort of the outputs that they wanted us to see, which would be the most efficacious. And I think a lot of them had the opinion that the full statements were sort of a requirement because they detailed everything. And so they essentially, I think this will go to show in our follow-up discussions that it's not necessarily the truth that you need someone to read 7 pages to get them to have sort of similar effects. There might be more easier disseminative ways for the information about the election integrity and anti-violence work to get out to kind of larger populations, particularly in areas where people might not be able to scroll through 7 pages of material. That being said, one of the first things that we would like to do in the aftermath that we haven't necessarily had a chance to do yet is integrate the final survey wave. So we've been talking here about the pre-election and post-election waves, but we actually added a third survey, which was smaller, but we randomized amongst 1,000 participants from the prior wave after the decision by the Supreme Court of Kenya. And the thought here was to test not only the longevity of effects to see if this lasted over the course of a month into the post-election period, but also to see whether a trust the judiciary's kind of statements about these fraudulent claims could itself have an influence on perceptions of integrity within the electoral system itself, but also serve to strengthen democracy. So can appeals to the Supreme Court, if it's done in a way and it's perceived to be independent, have an influence over perceptions of election integrity? So we'd like to do that as one of our next steps. Another thing that we're working on is exploring the composition and influence of electoral misinformation. So one of the things we didn't have a chance to talk about here was collections that we did online throughout this electoral period. So we actually collected lots of different data from different social media sites discussing the election. And then I've been leading an effort to kind of code a lot of this misinformation to see what it applies to, what types of misinformation there actually were online during the election. And you can see in the top right here, sort of some preliminary evidence that a lot of the misinformation that was there was non-provable, so couldn't necessarily be addressed by traditional fact-checking methods, which are the primary method for debunking in this region and throughout the world. And so to address that particular area of critique, to try to find another debunking claim, we've worked with the Center for Analytics and Behavior Change out of UCT to develop something we're calling social truth queries, which you can see an example of here on the right, where we have rolled out surveys that have real social media posts. The names are randomized and the photos are randomized, but real posts taken from during the election period. And then we randomize comments from individual users that kind of draw attention to different conceptions such as accuracy, veracity, social support, these types of issues. And so we're using this as a way of potentially democratizing fact checks to areas where there might not necessarily be a fact check, or fact checks are not necessarily applicable. And so this could be outside of social media platforms, on things like WhatsApp, encrypted messaging platforms, encrypted messaging applications, and other areas where there might be a fact check later on, but not necessarily quick enough to stop something from going viral. And so this is something else that we're looking into amongst a lot of other data concerns and interesting questions that we have still to answer. So thank you all so much. I think I'll pass it back over to Maddie.
Yeah, and I'll just add one last word on that last piece of those truth queries. That we're testing the impact of these kind of questions that people can ask on then other viewers' judgments of the information truth and whether or not they would share that information. And Morgan's done an initial study with some of this election with claims that have not been fact-checked, and we're finding some initial evidence that these kinds of questions can reduce other viewers' belief in the misinformation. So questions that draw attention to truth as a way to perhaps protect other viewers from that misinformation spreading online. So that's kind of an extension of this work where we're using some of the election misinformation. Yeah, and there's are a lot of other pieces of this project. So this is just kind of a sampling of some of it, but we've been really excited about the data that we have collected and what we have looked at so far, and also kind of what we're going to be able to keep doing with this data. And I think I just have, there's just a thank you slide here. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And so I think we have like a decent amount of time for questions that, if any, for any questions people have.
I'm sure we answered everything and nobody could possibly have any questions.
I know, I'm like, this is just, we were just trying to figure out what to put in this presentation, because there are just so many ways of looking at the data, and so many kind of, we have some pre-post measures, and we have the third wave. And so there are just kind of part of what this project is, we're figuring out like what's the best way to kind of look at the results and share them.
And I have a question. Did you get any pushback from Kenyans about why you're doing this study, or any questions from them?
It was so amazingly low, I would say. So for me, having run a lot of studies and run them kind of with university students and running them in online populations, this group of participants were highly motivated, highly engaged. Their performance on the attention checks were amazing. The way that they filled things out were really good. There were some places, so people didn't have to answer questions if they didn't want to. They had the option of going through. There were also, there were some spots, so when we asked them about who they voted for, they could say other and put some text, and some people were saying I don't want to share who I voted for. But those were a relative minority. Overall, I would say the response to the surveys was extremely positive, and you can see that on like the page in which we recruited people. And as part of the recruitment method at the start, people were also encouraged to tag their friends. And so that was one way in which we were able to recruit so many people, and people were very much excited to tag their friends and also like share, oh, this wasn't a scam, I got my money. And so, yes, there were some people, but relatively small, and especially compared to like other data collection I've done, I was pretty shocked at in terms of like the quality of the data and people's engagement with it. And it was a very highly motivated population and attentive population.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think that's all right. I think one of the really nice things about it is that I think you're competing not necessarily against other research projects, but against a lot of scams. And so when people do first get the incentive, they actually receive the airtime. A lot of times someone will be like, oh, is this a scam? And people who have already received airtime will come on, and we don't even have to to police the page too much, because they'll come and be like, no, for real, I got airtime for this. It's definitely worth it. I also think that the subject matter is not something that was sort of beyond local discussion. Misinformation was a very popular topic in the country in the build up to the election. So it was something that a lot of comments were about how it was actually an engaging survey. It wasn't just kind of a waste of time. And so I think it helped that we had something that people had heard about, at least domestically, and thought was an important issue.
Hey, thank you all. That was really interesting. My name's Enrique. I'm a law professor in North Carolina, and I'm an IDP fellow as well. Is it fair to conclude that based on the survey results, there was a fairly high degree of trust in epistemic authorities among the participants? And if that's true, did that surprise you? And if it's true, is there anything, maybe, not to essentialize or extrapolate too much, but is there anything particularly Kenyan that we might attribute, a high degree of trust in epistemic authorities with respect to the results?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think a lot of the work on misinformation in the global south in recent years has sort of been trying to figure out, what are the differences in trust, but also in partisanship and other types of group support across contexts. I think some of the work, especially out of India, has shown that partisanship is maybe not as influential in outcomes because of differences in trust and authority figures and institutions and these sorts of things. I think what our kind of preliminary results suggest is that it was more similar to some of the Western contexts than some of these other studies have shown. There was high levels of partisanship. I think some of this has to do with the outcome and not necessarily trust in authorities. There's, in addition to that, because it was such a close election, there were kind of these unexpected flips in the results that sort of set up what you would expect to be highly contentious post-election period. In terms of, we do have a lot of questions about trust, and we have a lot of different institutions and individual people as well, and we haven't really been able to dig into that. One of the things you might find interesting that we haven't really had a chance to look at is that a lot of the questions about trust in the past sort of just asked that, like, how much do you trust, the Election of and Boundaries Commission? And what I wanted to know is essentially, is that actually getting at underlying trust or support, or is that just sort of a question that people answer based on underlying vibes or something? And so we have additional questions in addition to just general trust. We have specific vignettes that ask, if this person or this community member or a member of the IEBC or a politician came across election fraud and came and told you about it, how likely would you be to believe them or support their action against this? And so we haven't had a chance to really look into that, but that might be something that we might be able to get back to you about that could be interesting.
Hi, my name is Noor. I'm a master's student at GW currently, and I wanted to ask about the misinformation sort of aspect of it, because I think it was mentioned at the end that you guys are still planning to look at different kinds of misinformation. So I wanted to ask what kind of platforms, how you guys are going to be analyzing that kind of data.
Yeah, is that on the specific versus non-specific versus, yeah, I'll let Morgan, yeah, Morgan's got the info in this too.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we've been trying to figure out how to kind of classify the types of misinformation we've seen. So for the surveys we conducted pre and post election, we took misinformation from several different sites. So whether it was from WhatsApp or Facebook, or was on, reported on the radio or the news. And so we had lots of different sources that we wanted to put in because we didn't want to just focus on a particular, misinformation in a particular sphere. For this post-election period, we were collecting mainly on Facebook and Twitter because that's the easiest places to scrape the data. And so it sort of had basically a large collection that was just collecting on any keywords about the election. So anytime they mentioned Ruto or Odinga or the Supreme Court or Kenya in any way, we have a subset of about 2 million posts from that period. And then from within that, I've gone through and kind of coded with with a particular undergraduate who's been very helpful, about 2,500 of these, and tried to classify them across these three boundaries. We've talked to kind of journalists and fact checkers about how best to split these up. And essentially what we're looking at right now is provable information, which is things that could very well and are kind of the target of traditional fact-checking methods, some sort of conspiracy that draws on evidence that doesn't exist or can be easily kind of falsified. Then there's a separate section that's basically non-specific or unspecific claims, which is things like, oh, this was fraudulent. It's not actually, you can't fact check it because it's not actually saying anything specific. It would be like, this person, committed fraud, or this person, it doesn't actually say what the intent is. And then there's this third category that we're working on, which is called non-public information, which would be, you technically could fact check it, but it would be so difficult to do, or it relies on insider information. And so this is sort of also outside the bounds of fact checking. So it'd be like, oh, the judge in this case, received money from this person to do this thing. It's possible to fact check, but very different than the kind of traditionally fact check things. And so those are the three things we're working on right now. And that may change, but it's been fairly interesting to see how much of this misinformation is actually outside the bounds of current fact checking efforts, which are kind of the focus of most of the investment.
Yeah, and coming from my background in psychology, where people are interested in how do you correct misinformation, they're kind of coming from the assumption of that you can fact check the misinformation. And it's what's really nice about what Morgan's doing is it's really kind of showing that there's this broad, probably the majority of claims, it's either very difficult for people to fact check, it's very time consuming, or you can't fact check it because there's not that information available, or it's non-specific. And so I think there's not a lot of work that's looking at how much of the misinformation can you actually fact check. And I think that this will be a really useful addition to that. And also then thinking about, okay, well, how do you then address this misinformation when you can't fact check it? Which is kind of, we have that truth query, those responses work to it. But there are other people who are also kind of considering then what do you do at this point?
Thank you guys so much.
Other questions?
I'll go ahead and jump in. First of all, thank you so much, Maddie and Morgan, for this presentation. Really refreshing to see a study that focuses on the Global South, and it really expands our sort of sense of what misinformation research can look like. So I had two questions. One sort of a minor question and one sort of a bigger picture. So you talked a little bit about this in your presentation, but you didn't quite get to balance in terms of candidate preference in this study. Could you talk to us a little bit more? You sort of hinted at a couple factors what that might be. Could you talk a little bit more about how you might test for those factors and what you think the ultimate impact or limitation that might have for the study? And second of all, I think that given sort of the state of misinformation research, which is overwhelmingly focused on the US especially, and to a lesser extent, other Western democracies, how does the perspective of doing this kind of work in Kenya give you a better, different, broader perspective on this research area as a whole?
So with the first question, are you speaking to people dropping out, for people having a preference for voting for Ruto, the winning candidate, in across the survey?
Yeah, because there seemed to be a significant skew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so in this, what you were seeing were people who completed those first two waves of data collection. And if you look at just people who completed this first wave, it looked fairly similar, but I think there was a few fewer people who voted for Ruto, which would then either indicate that the people who voted for Odinga then didn't complete the second wave, or it also seems like among the people who voted, and this is actually a finding, the people afterwards were more likely to say that they voted for the winner. So there's also the potential that afterwards then people are kind of going back and saying they voted for the winner, which my guess is that doesn't account for the full effect, but also plays in. And I do think that's to be expected, and also an important part, because then the people that you're getting, you're probably not getting the people that have maybe the higher levels of distrust. What we should do is look at if there's differential attrition compared to who people said that they were voting for in the first wave. So if they said they were tending to vote for one or the other, then are we finding any actual differential attrition? So it seemed like there was potential of that, but also not a huge effect. But that is definitely an important consideration, that you may not be capturing the actual the same, like there is that differential attrition. What is interesting, that in our first survey, we did find overall more people voting for Ruto, which was different than the polling that was being done, which were predicting Odinga. So our survey would have predicted the winner accurately, which was kind of cool, while the more official polls weren't. But that is something that's important to note, and with how we're reporting the data. And we can also just talk about kind of the first wave separately from then the people who completed both waves as well. So we have those kind of two different ways of looking at it. And then in terms of thinking about how this context influences or changes ways of thinking about misinformation, at least for me, something that was very interesting coming into this project, and I know a lot less about the global South and the political system then, but that these two parties were not polarized in the same way that, say, in the US is. And so it's not that people are like necessarily polarized in one party or the other. And it was interesting to me that there wasn't this kind of concern about misinformation leading up to the election, unlike in the US, where that was a huge topic of conversation. And then kind of misinformation played out during the election. Here, it seemed like people were relatively kind of similar on both sides. There wasn't this like there's more misinformation on one side versus the other, or people accusing more on one side or the other. But then the election process itself brought up that same kind of split that was very extreme. And so even in this climate where you're not getting people that are opposed on issues, you can still get this kind of split in perceptions of fraud and misinformation post-election. And I'll let Morgan talk a bit more about any of those pieces.
Sure, yeah, great question from everyone. But just talking briefly about representativeness, I mean, it's nice that our survey correctly predicted the winner, but I don't think we ever thought that it was, generalizable to the populations outside of online populations. And so I think one of the issues that you see with the kind of growing popularity of these surveys, which are much cheaper and actually allow you to reach specific populations that you would have very difficult time reaching if you were doing an in-person survey, so it can work both ways. I think it's just when you're coming up with the question itself, acknowledging the difficulties and sort of focusing on the populations, or at least the questions that you can answer. And so I think there's a tendency to try to claim generalizability overall for some of these surveys, which is just not the case. I think it's much more helpful to say, look, we're just looking at online misinformation. We're not necessarily addressing all the things that can occur offline. We're looking at highly online populations that are the most likely to be spreading this misinformation or to be interacting with it in these spaces, and then addressing those populations. And so that might not necessarily be representative of the country itself or of the voting population, of which many people do not have Facebook amongst them. But I think it's a very influential cohort of people, and does encompass a lot of people within the country and in other countries where these surveys are conducted. In terms of the kind of larger question, I think we're still in the exploratory phase when it comes to global South misinformation and misinformation and information access questions more generally. The kind of proliferation of the internet, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, although has grown exponentially in the past decade, is still missing a large swaths of the population, particularly in rural areas. And these populations are not necessarily the same as the populations that have recently or have prior to this received internet access. So there's no reason to suspect that a further 30% internet penetration will have the same effects it had for the last 30%. And so I think continuing to do these sort of exploratory studies and figuring out what crosses over will allow us to come up with interventions like the truth queries that might be able to be tailored to specific contexts, or pre-bunking initiatives that will work in particular areas while addressing differences and similarities across continents, regions, and specific countries.
Do we have a last question? Okay, last call on questions. All right, thank you so much, Maddie and Morgan. And please join us again in January, where our next Research Spotlight will feature Professor Miho on January 18th, I believe. So stay tuned for that, and we'll be sending out reminders about those. And thank you once again. Everyone have a good winter break and end of semester, and all the best for 2023.